Hey everyone, this is Dustin Farrell and I'm going to show you how I shoot and edit HDR time-lapse photography. What you're looking at right now is the back of my Canon 5D Mark II. It is pointing at the ceiling in my kitchen and I am shooting a shot of the light that's actually over my dining room table. Now you may be wondering why in the world I would be shooting the light in my dining room table, but actually this is a perfect example of how HDR photography can be beneficial. So in order to get my camera into bracketing mode or HDR mode, I'd go into the menu, and here is the auto exposure or the bracketing, auto bracketing function right here. Go ahead and hit enter. Now inside this menu I'm able to set the bracket amount that I would like to utilize in the camera. What I've found is that it's usually best to just go ahead and max out the Canon and go ahead and utilize the full dynamic range, and turn my shutter dial here and max it out to a bracket of 3 photos is what I'm going to take, being 2 stops underexposed, correctly exposed, and 2 stops overexposed. Now once I've confirmed this and decided this is what I want my bracket to be, just go ahead and hit enter. And now hit the menu button, get out of here, and now as you can see in the bottom, it's showing me that I'm about to take those 3 photos as I just mentioned. My camera's set in rapid fire or burst mode, so if I press the shutter button and hold it down, you're going to hear it take 3 consecutive photos. Just like that. So it just took my bracket, it took the 3 photos. I'll play them back for you. And there they are. So the first one there is the 2 stops over. Right there is the correctly exposed. If you were to do an auto meter and had everything in auto, that's probably the picture it would take right there. And there's your underexposed shot, which is going to bring back the details and the highlights there of the globe of the lights. So there's your bracket, 2 stops over, correctly exposed, and underexposed. And if I hit the shutter button again, boom, there you go, 3 more pictures. Now of course I would not do a time lapse in this method. I wouldn't continually hit the shutter button to do a time lapse. I would set up the intervalometer to do this automatically for me, and this is how I do that. Okay, the key to successful HDR time-lapse photography is your intervalometer and setting it up correctly. The secret little menu here, in order to set the intervalometer to keep taking your bracketed HDR photos in a time-lapse sequence, is the long menu. I think pretty much every intervalometer or even generic intervalometer has this long menu in it, because it's designed to hold down the shutter button for bulb exposures. So if I was to set this, let's say 10 seconds, and I was in bulb mode on the camera, it would actually take a 10-second long exposure. And it's really designed for people that want to take really long exposures. So you can use your intervalometer to take a 5-minute exposure, but instead of using it as in bulb mode and using it as a long exposure type of function, we're going to use it to take HDR time-lapse photography. So instead of doing 10 seconds, I'm going to go down to, let's say, 1 or 2, and go 2 just to be safe, just to ensure that I'm holding down the shutter long enough. So this is now, the intervalometer is going to hold down the shutter on my DSLR for 2 seconds. Now with the camera set to burst mode or rapid fire mode, if I hold down the shutter, or if the intervalometer holds down the shutter for 2 seconds, it's going to take the bracket sequence, meaning the 3 pictures that I have my camera set for. The next step is you need to set your interval. Now 1 second would be way too short for an interval, because it's not going to give the camera time to take the pictures or write the pictures to the card. So this could require a little bit of experimenting, a little bit of testing to figure out the amount of interval that you need to give your camera to take the pictures and write the photos to the card, and it all depends on the size of the pictures you're taking and the speed of your card. So right now I'm taking large raw photos with the Canon 5D Mark II, which are about 21, 22 megs a photo. But I do have a very fast SanDisk card, so it's going to be about a 3 or 4 second buffer that I need there for the camera to write all those photos to the card. But just to be safe, I'm going to go ahead and tell it to give me about a 5-second interval here. And since I'm spinning the 2 seconds here to hold down the shutter, it's really only going to be about a 3-second interval, which is still plenty of time for the camera and the card to write the files. So now once everything's ready and I'm happy with my settings, I go ahead and hit start. And there you go. 3 photos, remaining 3-second interval, 3 photos again.
Alright, now time to edit. So while you weren't looking, I opened up my favorite HDR program, which is SNS HDR Pro. The reason it's my favorite program is because it is the first HDR program that I have found that doesn't induce flicker into my HDR time-lapse sequences, and it is super easy to use. The problem with SNS HDR Pro is that it is PC only. However, I must say that if I was a Mac user, I would be tempted just to go buy a $500 or $600 PC laptop just for this program if I really wanted to do easy, nice looking HDR time-lapse sequences, because it is that easy to use and it produces such great results. In fact, SNS is what I use to do all the HDR time lapses in Landscapes Volume 2. Like this one right here, a really nice looking, natural looking HDR. It was actually, the clouds were blocking the sun. This is actually a pretty dark scene right here, and with the HDR, I mean, the clouds are popping, the rocks here are popping, and as you can see, no flicker whatsoever. Nice consistent luminosity throughout. Right there's another example of SNS HDR at work. And here we go to my favorite HDR time-lapse, done with SNS as well. And as you can see, absolutely no flicker whatsoever. And as I'm about to show you, is super easy to use. I've already ejected the compact flash card from my camera and I put it in the computer, and I'm going to go up here to the top left in SNS and I'll go ahead and open up an image, and I've already titled the folder Kitchen Lights, as you can see, and here's my bracket sequence. Here's the underexposed, correctly exposed, and overexposed photos. I'm going to go ahead and open up one bracket sequence. I'll go ahead and select these 3 photos because I did a 3-photo bracket, and hit open. There's no need to align the images because they're going to be aligned because I shot on a tripod, so I can go ahead and unclick that. I like to keep the deghosting and noise reduction clicked because, actually more or less just for the noise reduction. I've noticed that in dark areas of an HDR sometimes you'll get a lot of noise, and if that's clicked, it seems to take care of it pretty well. So that's pretty much it. You can reduce the size of your picture if you're worried about space and processing and stuff like that, but I usually like to try to keep the same size. So I'm all set to go, and go ahead and hit OK. So now here's SNS HDR Pro at work. Since the photos are so large, it will take just a little bit for the program to finish its tone mapping. Tone mapping is more or less, if you think about it in reverse, it's mapping your tones. So it's taking the optimal highlights and midtones and shadows from all 3 photos and putting them together and mapping them into one single image. So it takes it quite a while because the photos that I took are pretty large, and there's 3 of them. So with the magic of editing, I will go ahead and fast forward to the end here. Okay, so now the tone mapping is complete, and as you can see, the default value that SNS has given me definitely needs a lot of work. Sometimes it doesn't, but in this case it does, because I've got such dark shadows and bright highlights here that SNS was unable to give me a optimal result. But that doesn't matter, because I've got all my sliders over here to where I can tweak things. And if I was to go over all of this tutorial would be about a 5-hour tutorial. So I just suggest that you play around with these until you come up with a good looking image. The one unique thing about the way I do my HDR time lapse is that I don't really go for a really striking image out of SNS HDR, out of my HDR program. Actually, what I do is I go for something that's really flat. If you're familiar at all with like the S-Log out of the Sony F3, it's that really ugly flat looking image to where your highlights aren't really bright, I mean your shadows aren't real dark, and there's really not any contrast whatsoever. It's just really flat. That's what I go for, because I'm trying to preserve as many of the highlights and the shadows as I possibly can, so that I can take my sequence later into After Effects and do some more color grading inside of After Effects. So instead of really pushing contrast and whatnot inside of my HDR, inside of SNS here, I go for something that's really pretty flat. So I back all these contrast values down, and I end up with a really flat looking image. And it was about 5 or 10 minutes of tweaking, and I finally came up with something I was pretty happy with, and I saved that preset over here. And I can't remember what it's called. There it is, HDR blog. So there you go, that's what I've come up with. So now that I have my image the way I want it, all I have to do is go up here and hit batch process, and I'll open up this window here, and I've gone ahead just to speed things up and selected the folders and made a destination folder on the desktop. As you can see, so I need to pick the correct folder of where my raws are, make sure that I've told it that the correct image format that I am putting together, which is raw. And of course, that's a great thing about SNS, is you can pick a TIFF or JPEG and you can make HDR photos out of pretty much anything you want. And here you see the exposures. It just wants to know how large your bracket is, and mine is 3, and you can select all the way up to 20. Go ahead and select 3. Like I said before, I don't need the alignment, but I will keep the deghosting selected because it does help. I don't know why it doesn't say deghosting and noise reduction, but that does help the noise reduction. And I want to keep the photos the same size, so I don't want to reduce that. Now for destination, of course, you need to make another folder and tell SNS where to put your final images when it's done rendering each one of them out. So I made another folder here on the desktop called Kitchen HDRs, and I always render out my preference. I always render out 16-bit TIFFs, but if you wanted to do JPEG, you can do that. Change the quality to something like that, but I would never do that because I'm always aiming for high quality. So 16-bit TIFF is what I select. I don't want to convert anything, and make sure everything's good, and it looks like it is. I go ahead and hit start, and my batch processing begins. As you can see down here, you've got a status meter of the process of the batch, and since these are all large raw photos, the batch processing will take a while. And this is something that I always recommend that you start before you go to bed, or maybe before you go to off to a job or something like that, to where the render can take a while, because usually if you're going to batch process large raws, it's going to take about 6, 7, 8 hours for a good computer to complete. Okay, the batch processing is completed. SNS has generated 4 images for me because all I had was 4 different brackets. And I'll go ahead and click on that folder for you so you can see them, and there they are. And in order to process this into a time lapse, it would be a very short, boring time lapse, but I could if I wanted to. All I'd have to do would be open up my favorite editing software and import these as an image sequence, and I could make a time lapse out of these four photos. Now, of course, this is just for demonstration purposes, and I would never do a time lapse of my kitchen table lights. I would do something more along the lines of this. Here's a time lapse that I shot recently. It is a time lapse that was just made for HDR. It is of imperial sand dunes in California, and I've got my sequence here of bracketed images, and I want to go ahead and open up one of the brackets. I've already got 3 of them selected, and go ahead and hit OK. Okay, so now the tone mapping's finishing up, and for some reason the last little bit just takes so long to finish. And there we go, my tone map image. So I guess before I show you that, I should have shown you the under, the over, and the correctly exposed. There you go, under, which brings out, of course, the beautiful looking sky there. The over, so you can see the sand correctly exposed. You can see the sand a little bit, and the sky is more or less correctly exposed. And this is a sunrise, and of course the exposure is changing throughout, and that's another great thing about SNS, is it follows exposures really well, and there's not a lot of distortion that will occur in the process of like a 20-minute sunrise or something like that. So there's my 3 photos: under, overexposed, and correctly exposed. And right here you can see a little part of my dolly, but it doesn't matter. I'm going to crop it out in the final edit when I crop it for 1080p. So what SNS ended up with in my default value is this right here, and of course it needs a lot of work, which I've already done, and it's in a preset right over here, and it is called Imperial Lone Tree, and there it is. And once again, this image is actually a little bit more flat than what I would normally do if I was trying to render out a perfect looking HDR straight out of SNS. But like I said before, that's not my goal. I usually go with flat so that I can do additional grading and color processing inside of After Effects, which is what I've done with this. And as you can see, my final result, which is right here, turned out pretty good. And in fact, this is a sneak preview of a clip that will be in Landscapes Volume 3. And that's how I shoot and edit my HDR time-lapse sequences. For anything time-lapse related, including updates to my latest work, be sure to follow me at Dustin_Farrell.